Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to be giving a shiur today on Seif Nun. I know not everyone is up to Seif Nun. I don't know if anyone is up to Seif Nun. Because on the previous Seifim, most of it was already discussed in Shiurim, but I understand that there are some details which are not. It's Hashem, the next few days we'll be giving Shiurim on the Seifim which are before the Seifim of the Mems. There are interesting topics to discuss also in the previous Seifim, and hopefully we'll get a chance. We'll discuss them next year. We have a Mishnah in Mikvos, Perek Hey, Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah says, Noitfim sha'asom zoichlim. Noitfim is rainwater, sha'asom zoichlim. Soimech afilu makel, afilu kone, afilu zav v'zava v'yered v'tayva. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Yeah, means if there is a zchilah in a mikveh of noitfim, which is rainwater, which needs to be bashboiden, you could put a stick, even a zav or a zava could hold the stick in place, and the person could go to hold the zchilah, and the person could go into the mikveh and toivel. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Yossi argues and says, Kol davar shu mekabel tuma ein maschilim. By anything which is mekabel tuma, you cannot use to stop the zchilah. The Rosh explains what's noitfim sha'ason zoichlin. Mikveh, that it's the shaparatz al-sfasi, that the wall of the mikveh broke. Meim of yotzim v'zoichlim, and the water that are in there are leaking out. The Rosh has a whole different explanation on this Mishnah. Completely different. The Bechlal explains that it has to do with a discussion about whether you're allowed to be maschel and davar mekabel tumah or not, nothing to do with mikveh shenifratz. However, he first explains how even according to the Rosh, it should be explained differently. And he says, what's the Mishnah talking about, even according to the Rosh? He says the best way to explain it would be that here we're talking about a mikveh, that if you will not block the zchilah, there will not be mem sa'al left in there to toivel. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi makes the mikveh possible when it's a zav and a zava putting the stick. Why? Because the only way that there's 40 sa'al left in this mikveh is with the zav was a tumah, you're holding something which is mekabel tumah. However, if mem sa'al will remain even after this, even below where the crack is, then the Rosh says that according to everybody, you're allowed to toivel in that mikveh. Why? Because ikar ha-mikveh ein zeichel. The main part of the mikveh, which is the 40 sa'ah, is not zeichel.
But then I don't care about that 40 sa'ah. I don't care what happens to the rest. No?
We'll see. And Rabbi Yehuda, he says, so what's Rabbi Yehuda's shitta? Because Rabbi Yossi is machmir. What's Rabbi Yehuda's shitta? He says you're allowed to. Rabbi Yehuda, well, how can Rabbi Yehuda say that if you hold a mischila through davar mekabel tumah, it's kosher? He says because if the only time when it's a problem is when you don't have a mikveh kosher. And the way that you're going to get 40 sa'ah into there is going to be with a davar mekabel tumah, then the mikveh is possible. However, over here, you're not doing anything, rather preventing it from becoming possible. So it remains as cheskas kashas, and it's not a problem. So that's the way the Rosh explains the machlekes of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, that when the Rosh explains how it should be according to the Rosh. Right, we have the Tur on this Seif Nun. He says, Mikveh shenizdak echad miksalav. If you have a mikveh which one of the walls cracked and the water comes out of the crack, you're missing derech hasedek. Yesh poislin oisei afilu yesh bekama se'in beinyan shishar boi mem sacha sheyetzu derech hasedek. Some people are machmir that even if there's going to be more than 40 saw left below the crack, the whole mikveh is possible. Why? Being that the top water is quick to leave the mikveh, and the whole mikveh is considered zeichel, even though you have 40 sa'ah below the crack. Right? And the Beis Yosef right away explains, it brings the shitta of the Mordechai, that even if there are 1,000 sa'ah in the mikveh, if you have a crack and the crack is leaking out, for sure there's going to be more than 40 sa'ah left. Being that right now when you're toiveling in the water that the top water is going to be zeichel, so b'meila the whole mikveh is considered a mikveh zeichel, and you can't toivel. That's the first shit that the Torah brings. However, right away brings, but the Rosh says that if 40 sa'ah will leave, this is how he brings from the Rosh over here in the Torah. We'll see later that he has different opinions. If there's going to be 40 sa'ah left through after the water drops below the crack, then it's kosher. But if there's no 40 sa'ah left, then it's possible. Right? And then he brings the machlekes of how could you hold the zchilah. He says, according to the Rosh, you cannot use your hand or something which is mekabel tumah. According to the Rosh, you could hold something which is mekabel tumah. You could use something which is mekabel tumah even to block the zchilah, because only the water coming into the mikveh cannot be with a davar hamekabel tumah, but preventing it from going out could be with a davar hamekabel tumah. That's how the Tur explains his father's opinion, the Rosh, and he basically takes his father's pirush in the Mishnayos, the first pirush, and takes it lahalach. Yeah, now that is the beginning, the brief introduction to what it is. Now, the main point of the shiur is to discuss the shitta of the Tzemach Tzedek when it comes to zchilah, because it's important to understand how we paskin. There are two very long chuvas in the Tzemach Tzedek, Kuf Samach Daled and Kuf Samach Hey, which discuss a shaila of zchilah. They're both the same Rav. The first one is a tshuva, then the Rav came and wrote a response clarifying what the Metzias is, and the Tzemach Tzedek goes back and asking a few questions. Tzemach Tzedek explains his questions, and then he explains how, even with the new Metzias, how it should be done.
The Tzemach Tzedek's had their base, is it where we get Kollel from?
I don't know. We'll find out later. Okay. We're going to go through the Seder of Tzemach Tzedek in short. I'm going to try to summarize what Tzemach Tzedek says. It's a good 20 pages of Tzemach Tzedek between the two chuvas. So I'm going to summarize the main points of it. That's the ikar of today's shiur. First thing that Tzemach Tzedek tells you is like this. From the Rosh, the way the Rosh writes the Pirush in the Mishnah, it's mashma that according to the Rosh himself, even if there is no memsa after the leak, after the crack will be, after the water will hit the crack, it's still not considered a zchilah. And what he says that you need 40 sa'ah below the crack is only according to the Rosh. Because according to the Rosh, the Mishnah is talking about the zchilah below mem sa'ah. The Rosh himself, Bechlal, doesn't explain the Mishnah according that it has to do with the zchilah below or above mem sa'ah. The Rosh gives a whole different explanation to the Mishnah. So be'etzem, when the Rosh just says the difference between above mem sa'ah, if the crack, if it's going to be mem sa'ah left, it's not going to be mem sa'ah left. All that is a liba darash, according to the Rosh, not according to him, the Rosh himself. And what's the raya to this? The Tzemach Tzedek says very simple raya. There is the Remozei Harosh in the Torah. That's a summary, some of halachas from the Rosh. And that was written, it's printed in the Torah. And over there in Siman Yud Aleph of the Remozei Harosh, he brings the words of the Rosh. And then the Tur adds 4 words. He brings the words of the Rosh about the difference between the Rosh Machshir. Doesn't explain what kosher, what possible. Straight up, Rosh Machshir. And therefore, it seems Yesh Lahachshir B'chol Inyan. That's how it seems that the Rosh, the Tur understood, and the Ramazi HaRosh, the Tur understood his father's opinion that you could be machshir in any form. What exactly we're going to see soon. So what is the shit of the Rosh then? The way Tzemach Tzedek sees it, the way the simple shit of the Rosh is, if right now there is in the mikveh 40 sa'ah, you're allowed to tovel in it, regardless of what's going to happen after the leak is finished. You have a Tashbitz who also understood this in the words of the Rosh. The Rosh has a tshuva in Klal Lamed Aleph Siman Dalet, and that tshuva is also brought in the Beis Yosef. Over there, the Rosh says that a Zchilah is only when it's Zoichel like a mayam, a steady stream. But if it's dripping a little bit from the mikveh, then it's not considered a problem. So even if there is a recognizable Zchilah Nikeres, a recognizable Zchilah, as long as there's Mem Sa'ar right now, and even if after the Zchilah is going to be finished, is going to be less than Mem Sa'ar, still kosher, and the words that the Rosh Ein Ze Choshuv Zoichalim Klal. It's not B'chlal considered Zoichalim. Zoichalim is only when it flows out like a spring. So the Tashbitz understands from the Rosh that the Rosh, the same thing of what the Tzemach Tzedek just says, that the Rosh holds that even if there's not going to be Mem Sa'ar left after the crack, it's still fine. So who is Machmir? The Tashbitz says the Rosh is Machmir. But even the Rosh who is Machmir, that there shouldn't, if there's less than 40 Sa'ar left after this Zchilah, is only talking about shekol meimav, that all the water of the mikveh, zoichalin umisnanin lotzis, are shaking and are moving towards the exit of towards the crack. That means the definition of Zchilah is, even according to the Rosh, and for sure according to the Rosh, that the water, the whole mikveh is moving. You could see that water is moving towards the crack. That's similar to a mayam. That's a flow like a mayam. Otherwise, a slower Zchilah is not considered a problem, even if you could recognize there is a Zchilah. However, I quoted the Tur. The Tur himself does not say that in the words of the Rosh. The Tur himself, even though the Tur in Ramazi HaRosh writes that his father is Machshir, and when he writes in the Tur, he brings the understanding, the first explanation of the Rosh in the Mishnah, but the difference between above Mem Sa'ar, if there'll be Mem Sa'ar left, it's kosher. If it be less than Mem Sa'ar, it is possible. And the only kula that the Tur brings in the name of the Rosh is that you could block it with Davar Mekabel Tumah. Other than that, there's no other kula in the Rosh. So why is that? Tzemach Tzedek says the Rosh right away. The Tur says that the Rosh in the Ramazi HaTur, the Ramazi HaRosh, the Tur writes that is machshir, and that's mashma machshir b'chol inyan. In the Tur, he says only above 40 sa'ah. So why did in the Tur makes his father's opinion more machmir? It's not his father's opinion. So Tzemach Tzedek says maybe. Because in that tshuva of the Rosh that we just mentioned before, there is the Rosh concludes the tshuva by bringing the opinion of the Rosh about above Mem Sa'ar, and since he quoted him, obviously he didn't quote him just for fun. He quoted him because we should consider the option of being machmer like him. That's how Tzemach Tzedek explains why the Tur brings the Rosh.
We're not up
to the halach.
No,
Rabbi,
situation. I'm saying what the answer is that.
Tzemach Tzedek right now is discussing the Tur and the Rosh. Let's go. Rabbi Yerucham discusses this topic also. And he brings two separate dinim in two separate places. He splits up this halacha into two. And Tzemach Tzedek is going to bring a big diuk from Rabbeinu Yerucham. Yeah. One, he talks about a mikveh which has a crack or a hole. Over there, the Rabbeinu Yerucham says it makes no difference whether there's memsal left or not. And he doesn't mention machlekes Rosh and Rosh. So where does he bring the machlekes of Rosh and Rosh? In a separate din. Mikveh shenifrat tzfasei. And the mikveh that the wall, the top of the mikveh cracked. And there's a crack, not a crack, a hole through the wall. A crack, the top of the wall of the mikveh cracked. There he brings his machlekes of Rosh and Rosh. And we're going to explain soon, so I'm going to explain the difference between the two, why he only brings the machlekes of the Rosh and the Rosh in the case when the wall of the mikveh cracked, and not in the case when the top of the mikveh cracked, not in the case when there's a crack through the wall of the mikveh. It's mashma, it seems like Rabbi Yerucham also understood that when there is a crack through the wall of the mikveh, or a hole through the wall of the mikveh, yeah, it seems like from Rabbi Yerucham, he doesn't mention the Rosh and the Rosh over there, so he just says he just says it's kosher regardless of whether it's memsa or not. So according to him, it seems that even he doesn't bring the Rash even to argue. So it seems like according to him, even the Rash would be moide that such a case is kosher. And the only time the Rash will be machmir is when mikveh shenifrat tzfasei.
What's the Mishnah talking about?
The Mishnah says zechlin sha'asan noitrin. That's what the Mishnah says. The words of the Mishnah, Zechin Shasan Noich. The Rash says, Mikveh Shenifrat Al-Sfasei. Mikveh which cracked. So there's a diuk whether Al-Sfasei means above or Al-Sfasei means through also. The Rabbeinu Yerucham understands Al-Sfasei means above. Right? So what Rabbeinu Yerucham also understands the Rosh that way. So back to the question, why is the Tur machmir against his father? Why is the Tur take the Rosh? And this machmir explains the Rosh in such a way that the Rosh is machmir above below memsa. Above memsa, if it's more than memsa, he says kosher, below memsa it's not. When that is not the opinion of the Rosh, according to the simple explanation, the way Tzemach Tzedek understood it, according to Yerucham, according to the Tashbitz. So like we said before, it seems like the Tur wants to be machmir, being that the Rosh brings the opinion of the Rosh. The Tur understood the Rosh to mean that kind of chumrah. Therefore, we're machmir. Even though the Rosh himself doesn't hold like the Rosh la'alach, because he holds differently. But being that he brought him, sometimes you are machmir, even in something which you yourself don't hold of, you'll be machmir more in certain situations. That is the introduction of the Tzemach Tzedek to this Shiur. That's Ois Aleph, pretty much. Summary of Ois Aleph. Right? When it comes to what's going to be the halacha, we're going to get to much later. Right now, still, Tzemach Tzedek is going through. First, you have to understand the shittas, understand the difference in what's the definition of nifratz, what's the definition of zchilah, and then see how do you define such a zchilah. So, therefore, anything about halacha l'maisa we're going to get to later. Now we're going to jump to Ois Daled in the Tzemach Tzedek. Ois Daled, towards the middle of Ois Daled, the Tzemach Tzedek goes back to Rabbeinu Yerucham. It's back to the Shita Rabbeinu Yerucham. We said that what the Shita Rabbeinu Yerucham is, that according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, if you have a nisdak, if you just have a crack through the wall, or a hole through the wall, even if it's a big hole, it's not considered zoichlim, even according to the Rash. Because in the din of nisdak or nikav, the Rabbeinu Yerucham only brings the opinion, does not bring the machlekes of Rosh and Rosh. So it seems like we said before that even the Rabbeinu Yerucham understood in the Rosh, even the Rosh would hold that when it's a crack, it's not a problem. So who makes the difference between a big hole and a small hole? Big crack and a small crack? Not the Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham doesn't mention it. The one that makes the difference, differentiation is the Tashbitz. The Tashbitz says if you have a big hole, then the zchilah is recognizable. It's a leak like a mayon. That's when it's a problem. If it's a small hole, it's not a problem. What's the shear? we'll discuss what a shiur of a big hole, small hole, we'll get to later. And this is what the Mechaber writes in Sif Nun Aleph, that when you have a hole in the mikveh and it drips very little, and nivloim bekarka me'at, it's kosher because ain't schilos in the keres. And the Shulchan Aruch brings it, that comes straight from the Tashbitz. So the Tashbitz makes a differentiation between a big hole and a small hole. Ben Yerucham does not make that differentiation at all. He makes a differentiation whether the crack is through the wall or the top of the wall of the mikveh broke. So this is the ones who understood the Rosh. Now the Tzemach Tzedek says you have a Mordechai that we brought in the Beis Yosef. We brought the Mordechai. The Mordechai is machmer all the way to the other extreme. He says you have 1,000 saw in the mikveh, and there's a leak in the time. There's a zchilah. The whole mikveh is possible because all the water is going to go out. The whole mikveh is shaking to go out. And the Mordechai that the Beis Yosef brings, we can go through the Beis Yosef. The Mordechai, the way he explains that the Rosh holds. Yeah, he says that the Rosh holds that even according to the Rosh. Yeah, he says the way there's so what's the shit of the Mordechai? That being that right now, when you're toiveling in this mikveh, you're toiveling also in the top water of the mikveh, because you can't go into the bottom of the mikveh without going through the top of the mikveh. And your tevilah is in this whole body of water. So you're going into the water, and the top part of the water is a zeichelin. So the whole mikveh becomes zeichelin. Only the top is going to come out. No, the whole thing becomes zeichelin, and your tevilah is in the water, which part of the water is also zeichelin, and therefore, since a percentage of the water that you're being tevel in is zeichelin, your whole tevilah is possible. What? How are you going to tevel in the bottom? All the way down, but then all the water is connected. It's one package. Your tevilah is being kosher, including the water on the top. You can't. I don't think you can separate them. There's actually the whole discussion whether you could say breira in such a din or not. Whoever knows the din of breira, machlekes of yesh breira, ein breira, and the deraisa and the rabban. Whether you could separate the water. The Tzemach Tzedek will go into that later in Oisches. About whether you could separate the water that's leaking out from the water that's still inside. So the first thing that Tzemach Tzedek says is, even according to the Mordechai, who says that the whole mikveh becomes possible, it's only at the time of the zchilah. Right? He asks the question, why? Question was just asked now, why does the whole mikveh become possible? If the bottom is, he asked the question in a different way. He says the top, which is zoichel, is connected to the bottom, which is not zoichel, so the top should be kosher. Well, a shocker, yeah, the top should be kosher. The bottom is kosher. The top is zeichlin. So when you connect the two, why does it become possible? So I'm saying we'll get to later why, according to the Mordechai, the top is possible. So the question is why the top is possible, not was now. So Chassidus continues and gives you a new. This is in a we'll call it in a side nekuda that he discusses over here, that is important to understand. It brings it as a side point, but it's important to understand because of the question that was discussed, the question that came up, that was asked to the Tzemach Tzedek. He says, the zchilah that's being discussed over here is not a zchilah which is possible midiraisa. Because that zchilah is only a zchilah which is like a maya. Like we brought from the Tashbitz. The zchilah over here, zchilah through a crack, is not a zchilah flow like a maya. That zchilah is not possible in the Torah. It's not in the category of Zechel. It's possible in the Torah. It's only midrabanan. So therefore, if you have mem sa'ah under the crack, there'll be mem sa'ah left in the mikveh after the zchila is finished. It's kosher even according to the Rosh. And so Achzelek says, why can't you say that this zchila is a zchila deraisa? Why do you have to say it's a zchila derabanan? So like this, being that something which is also midiraisa, is also b'mashu. There'll be a zchila midiraisa, it would be possible. It would be also b'mashu. It wouldn't be something which has a shiur. No, everything in deraisa, if it's a zchila, it's a chametz is also b'mashu. Other things which are also, you don't get punished for isurim below a certain amount, but it's also the isur. The deraisa is also in the mash. It's also, but over here you don't have that. In the zchila, all the discussions are what's the size of the zchila? A big zchila, small zchila, this kind of zchila, that kind of zchila. You do see it, you don't see it. So there's different shiurim given to the zchila. So obviously, if there's different shiurim given by Chachamim, the whole thing is the zchila that's going through a crack, which is not a zchila like a mayan, is midirabanan, not midirais. Yeah. However, he obviously repeats what he said before. Even all of this according to the Rosh, because the Rosh is the one that says that if there's less than 40 saw left, it's a problem. According to the Rosh, so Machzedek already explained that according to the Rosh, it's mashma that that's even below 40 saw, it's not a problem to taival in it. If there's less than 40 saw left, it's still kosher. And I'm going to go to the Tzemach is going to get into the words of the Shulchan Aruch. So we're going to read through the words of Shulchan Aruch in Seif Nun. He says, the Shulchan Aruch says, Mikvah shemek shamim shenifratz echad miksalov, that one of the walls cracked, v'mayim yotzim derech hasedek, and the water is going through the crack. If there'll be memsal left until after the water goes through the crack, and it's kosher. And if not, imlav possible, because zechlin and the mikvah is not metar b'zechlin. And the Ramah right away says, "V'yesh machmilim afilu misharu memsal dasedek." Even if there is 40 saw, some people are still machmir. Yeah, who is that? That's the Tur in the name of Yeshemrim and the Beis Yosef in the name of the Mordechai and the Yeshemrim and the Tur. And the Tur and the Ramah says, "V'yishlochash livreim lechatchila, listem hasedek." You have to be choishish to them and close the crack in the mikveh. Because the dafka mikvah shenabam mayan, and by mayan lachosh zchilas, if it comes from mayan, you don't have a problem of zechlim. And you see a samayim kol zechlin, elak she'ein choizrin lemikveh. What's considered zchila? Very important din that Ramah says, when the water that comes out is not coming back into the mikveh. If it goes out and it comes back in, it's not considered a zchila. That is the Ramah writes. And the Bach on the Tur says also you have to. It's good to be machmer like the Mordechai, to close to make sure the Tov lahachmer. The Ramos is also the Tov lahachmer lechatchila. The Mechaber says, the Bach says l'maiser should be machmer lechatchila like the Mordechai, to close the hole even if it's going to be more than 40 saw after the crack. The Tzemach Tzedek does not agree bichlal with the Mordechai. Tzemach Tzedek asks questions on the Mordechai, and the words that the Mordechai said, the words Tzemach Tzedek says, the Mordechai is machmer tuva, it's two machmer against the Rosh and the Raviyah. He says, Yeshloimar lahokar karosh. The words that Tzemach Tzedek uses, it should be make like the Rosh. Nira ikar kipsaka shulchan aruch v'loi kabach. The Iker is like the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch and not like the Bach. That if you have 40 saw left, you don't have to worry about the zchila. And you could toivel even in the water above the zchila. means you don't have to. You're not worried about it. It means there's going to get to a question soon whether you have a miktoivel in the bottom water when there's a crack in the middle of the mikveh and there's 40 saw left. You have to go all the way below the crack, or you could toivel also in the water above the crack, because that water is for sure going to go out at some point or another. We'll get to that later, but that's a question that's going to come up. So that just tells you that there's no reason to be machmir like the Mordechai. If there's going to be 40 saw left after the mikveh, after the stops drain, you could toivel even in the water on top of the crack. This is the first 6 oisius of this tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek. It's a long introduction, and now the Tzemach Tzedek comes to tell you what the question is that he was asked. Usually you ask the question in the beginning, the shaila that he was asked from the Rav. Now he comes to tell you the question. Yeah, what happened over here? There was a mikveh. There was one hole, there was a mikveh. Next to it was an empty hole. And the way they would do is, they would pour boiling hot water into the mikveh on the right, which was empty. And it would take about 3-4 hours until the water would even out. And there was holes connecting the 2 mikvahs together. And it would take a few hours till the water evened out in this mikveh. And the Rav of the town said to be machmer. Why did he want to be machmer? Especially because the holes are below the line of memsa. So lu yitzur, all the water would leak out. Technically speaking, in Mela, it is a zchilah. From one hole to the other hole. The few hours until the water settles. He was machmer. The shaila is if the water is continuing to flow through the ground, disappearing, you're not exactly sure. Any bird? No, this is a lot more than that. So Tzemach Tzedek explains why it's not a problem. He says, it starts in Zion, he says, first of all, it's not a zchilah. Why? Because the water is only moving from one side of the mikveh to the other side of the mikveh. Yeah, basically there was one boil which was the kosher water. The other boil was never empty completely. It didn't have rainwater. They would add hot water into there, and then they would wait till the water would even out. And there was the way Tzemach Tzedek understood the question was talking about 2 even boilers, a boil on the right, a boil on the left. Yeah. Which other way would they heat it? They don't want to lose all the water that's there. And they wanted it to rise up, and then maybe they didn't have enough water to go into. They would pour water into one, and then they would all connect together. Something like that. Yeah. So he says, even though that if the mikveh would be empty, the boil on the right where you pour the hot water would be completely empty, all the water would go out. But poil right now, both of them are somewhat full. So the water that's moving from one side to the other side is not leaving the mikveh. So it's not considered zchilah. That's point number 1. Second of all, a separate question. We know that you need to have roiv make shamim in the mikveh. To make it kosher, you add maim shuvim into the boil. You can't have it has to be a majority. It has to be You have memsa in the mikveh, but it's in two places. Yeah. So you have memsa. So over here, he says you put the water, you pour these pots of hot water into the hole. And after the water evens out, what happens? You have half of the hot water here, half of the hot water there, half of the kosher water here, half of the kosher water there. So it's all, since you have memsa, so it's all kosher. And then the Machzedek continues weiter, even according to the Ramah. That the Ramah says that you have to be machmer like the Mordechai, lechatchila, when it comes to zchila, even when there is memsa left. So here you have memsa between the two. So even according to the Ramah, says you have to be machmer. So Machzedek says the words nira lahakil v'lei lachush klal. In this case, you don't have to be chayshish. Why? Because what's going to be zeichel, what's actually zeichelin, is very little. Yeah, and what's the proof to it? That when you have zeichelin, which is less than the ikr water, it's not a problem. Because we learned in the beginning of the Siman about a river that has more water, more rainwater than the Mayan. So we say Rabbi on zeichelin, you have more of the water that's being zeichel over the Mayan. But if you have less, it's not a problem with zchila. So even if you're going to say now that when I pour the full pot of hot water into the board on the right, half of that pot moved to the second board, was zeichel to the second board. Yeah, which we already explained is not considered a zchila according to the Rosh. So the Rosh doesn't count b'chlal as zchila, and moving from one side to another side is not considered a problem b'chlal. But still, even if you were to say that it's a zchila, it still becomes bottled because it's more kosher water than that.
Okay, so it's Machzedek. It sounds like Machzedek says that if it's a tiny zchila, it's not an issue.
The Rosh says it. No, that's the next thing. Yeah, that's the next thing he says now. That's the next point he says now.
So what's that? So what's the old kind of Rosh on the hit with double? You don't have the chash. It's a little zchila.
Let's focus on what we're doing here. The Mordechai says. So Machzedek says, what the Mordechai says, that possible when you have 1,000 sa'ah and the top water is going to leak out, is only when the zchila is a zchila anikeres. What's the definition of zchila anikeres? That you see the water falling on the walls of the mikveh, out of the mikveh. You see the crack and you see it coming out the other side and it's falling out. Or there's a crack on top of the mikveh and you see the water zeichel going out. But over here, you can't see the zchila of the water. You have two bites, you can't see the zchila of the water from one to another. And even if, according to the Mordechai, you would need, you have a shaila, the majority of the water maybe is kosher, the less is possible. He says over here you don't have the problem because the pot is less than, if you pour a pot and it's two equal bites, half goes here, half goes there, it's still less than the water that's in there, so it's not a problem. Right, and then comes to the oisches that I mentioned before about the din of breira. So Machzedek brings a question. He says, we know a rule, b'deiraisa ein breira. When it comes to something which is deiraisa, you can't say breira. Din of breira, you learned Deira is in smicha, you separate, you say, choose one thing, say, I'm choosing this way when you have something which is mixed. So in deiraisa, you can't say breira. Only in the Rabbanan you could say breira. So over here, as long as the leak is actually happening, there's no way of deciding which water is going to come out of the crack and which is not. And being that the zchila is a shaila of a deiraisa, maybe we should say en breira. And therefore, since you don't know which water is going to come out, even if there's going to be 40 sal left in the mikveh, being that you don't know which water is going to come out until the water goes out, so you can't toivel in the mikveh which has a crack, even if there's going to be 40 sal left over there, because in breira you don't know which water is going to come out, and all the water is possible. That's one of the tirutzim from before. Yeah, that's one of the zchila zerabanim. How do you know? The whole water is mixed up. You don't know where it's going to. A person's going to go in and push the water up, push the water down. You don't know. So the Machzedek brings three explanations in oisches. Well, the second explanation is, even when we say yesh breira, yeah, in a place when it's oimed lisbarer bevadai, when you know for sure there's going to be a separation, then we do say yesh breira. We do say the concept of breira even in the deraisa. And over here, down the line is going to be clear for sure which water is going to stay in the mikveh and which water is not. Now you can't see it. Later it's going to be known. So oimed lisbarer, it's going to be breira by itself. So b'meila you could say yesh breira even now. Right? And what water is it? As the Machzor explains to you. Which water is going to come out of the hole? Mayim asmuchim sheyu smuchim lakoisel. The water which is close to the wall is going to come out.
How do you know that the water that you table in is not the water that has to be passed?
Once you know, if you say yesh breira means you're going to choose. You say in your head, I'm toiveling in the water that's not coming out.
How does that answer help? Like you say, if you know what water left.
Once you say that there's going to be oimed lisbarer bevada, you could say yesh breira even in the derais. You could say yesh breira. You could say I'm choosing this. Huh?
What's the water left? I don't know what's the water in.
But the water that you're toiveling in, you say is the water that's going to stay. Which water is going to go? The water that's next to the wall, next to the crack, not the water where you're toiveling. So you can't stand right next to the crack. That's the Machzor is going to get to it later. That it's not. When the Zchilah, the water is going to get to that hole later. It's not. The Zchilah is only in the water which is next to the wall. He says he mentioned it in short, and a different shubi later explains it much stronger. The third explanation that Tzemach Tzedek says over here in Oisches, why we don't have the issue of breira, is because when do we say ein breira b'deraisa in a deraisa? Is only when without the breira, this thing would remain aser. You have something which is a cheskas isur. We say ein breira in a deraisa, so you can't separate it, so everything remains in cheskas isur. Over here, the mikveh is the majority of good water. So it's b'cheskas heter. And you cannot remove the cheskas heter of the whole mikveh based on the ein breira of part of the mikveh. Even if you want to say ein breira on the minority of the water of the mikveh, which is the water that's going to come out of the crack, it's above, there's a 40 cell left over there, that category of ein breira on that amount of water cannot make the rest of the water ois kosher, can't cancel the cheskas kashrus. Ein breira is only when you have something which stays aser. But over here, it has a cheskas kashrus. So you're not going to remove the cheskas. You're not going to say ein breira and then convert it from a cheskas isur, from a cheskas heter to a cheskas isur. So Tzemach Tzedek says, no, over here we do say yesh breira. Therefore we say yesh breira. And you can't take the majority of the mikveh, which is the memsa, which is kosher, and make it possible because of the minority of the water which is going to go out. And especially like Tzemach Tzedek says, that what water is actually being zaychel, only the water right next to the wall, not the rest of the mikveh. It's only a miut that's being zaychel. So therefore you can't pass the whole mikveh. So we say yesh breira. And now Tzemach Tzedek says like this, oistes. All this is only according to the Rosh. And only if you're going to say that all the water that's going through the crack is actually zaychelin. We're working right now under a premise that the water which is going out through the crack is zaychelin. Who says? Yeah. When you say that all the water coming out of the crack is zaychelin, so b'meila you have to make sure there's 40 saw, according to the Rosh. But the Tzemach Tzedek says no. Remember the tashbetz we wrote in the beginning, that the definition of zchilah is when it goes out like a mayon, not stam a crack. Even according to the Rosh, if it drips out a little bit, it's not considered a zchilah. So be'etzem, only a big crack is a zchilah. Small is not zchilah. Yeah, why? Because in the big crack you see the zchilah going out. In the small crack you don't. So be'etzem, the water, when you have a zchilah, which is a small zchilah, it's not mechal zchilah. The water is not being Zaychel. So this whole thing we just explained until now, to calculate above Memsa, below Memsa, it's irrelevant because the water is going out. It's not a Zaychel. Yeah, so Tzemach then concludes the Shuvah with a small point.
Yeah, that's only for what?
Huh?
The Rosh said that it's over, it's not a hole. Tashma said
It's one of the, that's the another. Rabbi Yerucham says about crack over. Yeah, that's what the Tashma says. It's not. Maybe it's Bechal and Zchilah. So Tzemach Tzedek concludes as follows in this Shuvah, Kuf Samach Dalet. First of all, when you have a crack versus a hole, a crack is better. Why? Because when do you say there's Iruv Mikvos? You know, there's a Beira Shok, you have to have a hole, just Shveres HaNeid. If you have over here, this crack is much less than Shveres HaNeid. And by Mela, if it's not Shveres HaNeid, it's not considered Zchilah. Small crack is definitely could be made. If you have even a small hole that the Zchilah is not Nikar, yeah? This is what it concludes. If you have a small hole, obviously less than Shveres HaNeid. So even if you have less than Mem Sa'ar going to remain in the mikveh after the whole thing, after the water hits the hole, if there's Mem Sa'ar in the water right now, you're allowed to be tayvel on it. Second point, to make the whole mikveh zoichelin based on the fact that the water is going to go out is a chumreh Bilitam, he says, even that's the Mordechai, the Mordechai, and even it's understanding according to the Rosh, and therefore the water, even the water above the crack, is not considered Zeichlin. He says there's no reason to be machmer like him, especially since the Rosh is completely chelik. He takes the opinion of the Rosh, especially if you could toivel. If you could toivel in the 40 sa'ah that remain. That means, if the crack is in such a place, even according to the Rosh, that you could toivel in the 40 sa'ah that remain, that means afterwards, then it's not going to be a problem. Yeah? That means that the crack is in a certain point, and there's going to be mem sa'ah over there, below the crack. And in that area of the Mem Sa'ah, technically you could be toivel. That means it's high enough that you could be toivel. You could lay down in that section where the Mem Sa'ah are. So the whole mikveh becomes kosher even above the crack. That is pretty much Siman Kuf Samach Daled of the Tzemach Tzedek. Yeah. This tshuva, yeah, it's not going to be considered. Yeah, not coming out of the mikveh. You have two holes, one next to another. So it's not going out. The two holes are connected. So it's not just moving from one hole to another hole within the same mikveh. Well, the Rav went and sent the Tzemach Tzedek a response. He says, first of all, the Metzius is different than what you describe. The mikveh where you pour the hot water is a smaller hole than the mikveh where the kosher water is. What? The mikveh where you pour the water into, it's a much smaller hole than the other one. So therefore, even after the water will even themselves out, there's not going to be a majority of original water in the boil where you pour the hot water. So you have a small boil. Next to it, you have a big boil. You're going to pour all the hot water into the small boil. It's going to overwhelm the water that's originally there. And the majority of that boil is going to be water that was not in the mikveh originally. That's the first point. Yeah. And he brings a few other questions on what the Tzemach Tzedek says. So that's what Tzemach Tzedek writes the next Shuvah, Siman Kuf Samachay. So first thing is about this concept. Tzemach Tzedek says, Take, if the hole on the right is smaller, and by pouring the hot water, there's not going to be original water left inside, l'chatchila you cannot be makel against the Ramah. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek is matzia to make a hole which is sheferes hanoid between the small hole and the big hole, then it becomes a shaka. You have a serious hole between the two, then it becomes a shaka, sheferes hanoid becomes a shaka, and it's fine. And then it becomes one mikveh. Yeah, and then he add So all the water is in one. This is three.
When the hot water, the kosher water is at least small water.
No, that's the thing. It's not sure if it's going to be memsal there. It's the majority.
Not even memsal
right now, but it's all connected. That's what it says. Make a hole, connect all the water together, and then it all becomes it's all one mikveh. It says make a hole, so it becomes one mikveh. Iru mikvahs. The Rav asked a few questions. The Machzedek goes through all these questions. I'm not going to go through it. It's actually a pretty long children. I'm just going to go through the important points. One of the questions he asks is, why is the Machzedek so reliant only on the Rosh? Ultimately, the Rosh is a das yachid. It's not a Rosh is a das yachid. So the Machzedek first of all tells you the Rambam is mashmei holds like the Rosh. The Rosh is not a das yachid. If you want to follow the Rosh, there's different ways of understanding the Rosh. You can't even say you're going to go according to the Rosh. The Rosh, some shittas are going to be matter, the way we understand the Rosh. Whether it's only talking about a crack above, there are different ways of understanding the Rosh. What the Ramah says, Yesh lahachmir. Who tells you that the reason why the Ramah says to be machmir is because he holds that all the water is zeichel? The Ramah is machmir for a different reason. Be'emes, the Ramah holds that the rest of the mikveh is not zeichel. The Ramah wants to be machmir for a different reason. Yeah, because what's the Ramah's chumrah? He says, up until now, how did we understand this discussion of Zchilah? He says that the way we understood it right now is when you have a crack and there's going to be memsa'ah left below the crack, it makes the top water kosher also. We don't passel the top water. That's how we understood until now. So you could toivel in the top water even though the crack is there. As long as it's going to be memsa'ah left below the crack, you could toivel even in the top water. And that is according to the Rosh and Rabbi Yerucham. And the Torah understood it in the Rosh also. Yeah, but the Ramah is, on that the Ramah is machmir. That's what the Ramah is machmir. On the water that's above the crack. That's what he says, the water above the crack, it should be machmir. Yeah, but from the Rosh, yeah, this is all according to the other principle. From the Rosh himself, the way that's Machzedek understood the Rosh, or Tashbetz understood the Rosh, he's completely opposed to the Mordechai. Even if there's 1,000 se'ah, which are going to leak out of the mikveh, but you're going to have 40 se'ah left on the bottom, it's still fine. It's still kosher. And you could toivel even in the top water. That's the understanding of the Rosh. So now you have a question. In the previous Shuvah, the Yesod, one of the Yesods that the Machzedek brought, one of the Rayos the Machzedek brought, was based on from the river, that the only issue is when you have more rainwater overwhelming the Mayim. So therefore, we say that the Roiv is overwhelms. But when it's a miut, it's not a problem. But over here, if you're going to say memsa'ah, and memsa'ah stays below, and the 1,000 se'ah are going to leak out, the roiv is zeichlin. So why are you machshir the whole mikveh? How could the Rosh machshir the whole mikveh if the majority of the water is going to leak out? The majority is zeichlin. The minority is not zeichel. So he explains, just remember that the Zchilah over here is talking about Zchilah midrabanan, not Zchilah midraisa. The first point. What's the problem with the river? That the water is all going to flow together. The kosher water, the whole river is flowing together. Over here, what's flowing out? Only the water which is right next to the hole is being zeichel. That's the Tzemach explains to you a gather. Only the water which is right next to the hole is being zeichel. The rest of the water is ashboyre. Even if it's going to go out, the rest of the water is still considered ashboyre. Only the water right next to the hole is considered zeichel. Huh? Yeah. And therefore, no, Bechlal says, therefore, according to the Rosh, and therefore, that the rest is kosher. It's a very small minority is being zeichel. You see the water is moving. You see the water is going to go out. You see the water moving towards the hole. The water that's not next to the hole is moving inside the mikveh. It's not moving outside the mikveh. It's moving inside the mikveh. Moving inside the mikveh is not a problem. The only issue is water going out of the mikveh. The water that's going out of the mikveh is only the water next to the hole. The rest of the water that you see moving around in the mikveh, moving from here to there, one right to left, left to right, is moving within the mikveh. And the water inside the mikveh is not a problem to move. It could move from right to left, left to right. It's only a problem if it goes out of the mikveh. What goes out of the mikveh is only the water, which is right next to the hole. So the whole time, the majority of the mikveh is not zeichel. Even if you have 1,000 sa'ah, which is going to go out, at any point in time, 990 sa'ah are not going out, are not zeichel. It's not next to the crack. Even though down the line it will all go out. And this is the machlok. This is where the machlok is the Rosh and the Rosh is. He says the Rosh holds that being that the top water is potentially zeichel because it will go out. Therefore, you need 40 sa'ah under the crack to connect to it to make it kosher. According to the Rosh, it's not being zeichel now, but it's going to be zeichel. And being that it's going to be zeichel, being that water is going potentially to be zeichel, it's going to go out of the mikveh. So you need 40 sa'ah below to make that mikveh kosher. And through connecting the two waters. But so that's when the Rosh will agree with the Rosh. You need 40 sa'ah below. That means you need to be mechaber the top water, which is potentially going to go out. You have to be mechuber to water which is kosher. Then you could toivel on the top water also. And in this case is where the Ramah is machmer. The Ramah is machmer not to toivel on the top water, even though it's not zeichel. Because potentially down the line it's going to be zeichel. Not potentially, it's going to be zeichel later on. Right now it's not zeichel, it's not next to the crack. That's when the Ramah is machmer. And if you want to say now, that says, we have the Tashbitz that he says that when it's a big hole, all the water is considered zeichlin. So Tzemach Tzedek says all the water considered zeichlin doesn't refer to the water below the crack. Obviously not. Only the water above the crack, when it's a big hole, is considered. You see it flowing out, it's considered zeichlin. According to Tashbitz, Tzemach Tzedek doesn't hold like that. Tzemach Tzedek holds that only the water next to the crack is zeichlin. All the rest of the water is not. He says, if you're going to find that there is an opinion that the water, that when the top water is leaking out, the bottom water is also zeichlin. That's what's understood from the Mardechai. You can't toivel. The whole mikveh becomes possible while the zchil is going on. It says that's a svara. It's neged asvara. It's against common sense, and they are a mute against the poskim, and that's a shit of the Mardechai. That even below the hole, when there is a zchila going on, even below the hole, all considered a pasal mikveh zchila. So he says, no, the Mordechai must be talking about a mikveh that the crack was on top of the wall, not through the wall. Like we mentioned before, the crack was on top of the wall. And you see the water flowing out, and you see it on the other side of the wall, the mikveh that it's flowing out. That's when it's a problem. Because the Mordechai does not mention nistak, a crack through the wall, or nikav, or a hole through the wall. The Mordechai is mentioned nifratz asvaso. So what's the svara of the Mordechai? Why is the Mordechai machmer and nifratz? He says because right now, let's say the water is right by the crack, right? It's not a crack; it's a breach in the wall of the mikveh. So before the person went into the mikveh, the water was right by the breach, right by the breach, because the water went down until it stopped. Now a person is going into the water. When a person goes into the water, he displaces the water, he causes the water to rise, he's causing the water to come out of the mikveh. And that water is going out and not coming back in. So that means that at the moment that he's toiveling, the water which covers him is water which is zechel. Part of the water which is covering him and making him tired is zechel. It was a few times, maybe. Yeah.
What do you mean?
Because the water goes out, and then he's going to come out, the water's going to drop, he's going to go in a few times, it's not going to go out anymore. Yeah, so there's nothing that's blocking that water from coming out, so all that water becomes zeichel. But in Nizdak, if there's a crack, even according to the Mordechai, yeah, even though through your tevilah, you're moving around water in the mikveh, and ultimately that water will go out of the crack. Yeah? That water is not going out at that moment. The water is above the crack. It's going to take a few hours till the water is going. A few hours, maybe a day, 2 days, depending on how big the crack is and how big the mikveh is, until the water is going to go out. So over there, the Mordechai is not machmer. The Mordechai is only machmer when there's a crack above it. At the moment that you're being toivel, that moment is a zchila, because that water is going out right now, and that water can't make it kosher. But the water which is inside is going to go out down the line. It's not seichel. So what does he say? So Machzedek brings like this. He says, if you calculate how much water is going to come out of the mikveh, yeah, and he uses the example of 1 part of 240 out of 20 saw. Essentially 1 part out of 480 of 40 saw. It means divide 40 saw into 480. That amount of water. If that amount of water goes out while you toivel, it's not considered a zchil. He brings us an example. So you know at least that amount of water, you divide 40 into 480, you'll know how much is for sure not, and goes out is for sure not considered a zchil. So he says, the Machzedek explains that when there's a crack, even according to the Mordechai, it's not considered a zchil. So the whole thing we said until now that the Mordechai is machmer is only when there's a crack above. The Rosh is make when there's a crack above. When there's a crack through the wall, the Machzedek explains even according to Mordechai, it's fine. Yeah, and even according to the ones who are machmer in the Rosh, is also fine. The Rosh is also talking about a crack that's on the wall. And the way Rabbi Yerucham also separates the din of that all fits perfectly with Rabbi Yerucham. Rabbi Yerucham, when it comes to the din of a crack through the wall, doesn't mention anybody, any machlekes. Only when it comes to a crack, to a breach in the wall, he mentions it. As the Machzedek concludes, therefore, even according to those who are machmir, whatever is below the crack is for sure not zeichlin. And even if there was this, you go into the mikveh and the water is going to rise, and ultimately down the line is going to go through the crack, it's not considered a zchila because it's not going out right now, and the tefillah is kosher. And especially since the zchila is not recognizable. Why? Because in this case, when you have 2 holes right next to another, even if there's going to be a zchila, it's moving from one body of water to another body of water, and you don't see the leak going out. And in the other mikveh, you also don't see the leak coming in, because you have water on one side, water on the other side. It's moving from one to another. You don't see a stream coming out of one mikveh falling into the other mikveh. The crack's on the bottom, so it just pushes the water up. So you don't see a zchila. It's not Zchila Nikeres.
So that would be also a situation that the second one is a smaller one?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Second what? Wait till the water, but you don't see the Zchila anyways, yeah.
Right, so why does he say to wait till it evens out?
Huh? Tzemach Tzedek also says to wait till it evens out.
You just said we don't have to.
The tefillah is kosher when you go in. It's not considered the din of Zchila. The wait for the still you should wait for it to go down. It's better to wait for it to even out. He said himself says wait till it evens. You should wait till it evens out. Huh?
Why is it better?
Why is it better to wait till it evens out? Because when it's going down, you see the water dropping. It's not mamish Zchila on the keres, but you lose. Huh?
It's not as long as it's going
It's not a Zchila on the keres, but you still see the water. You still see that water is disappearing from the mikveh. It's not possible if you go in there, the mikveh is kosher. Still, you should better to wait. What? No, it's Shvesna is to solve it. It says before Shvesna.
Before again?
Yeah. And even if you do have, he says, even if it would be a schila, he says, even if you would consider it a schila, he says, again, he repeats, he concludes that water, that what's considered a schila, only the water which is right by the crack, and not the water which is away from it. So even, therefore, you're allowed to toivel even above the crack, because the majority of the water is not being zaychel right now. So then he concludes, he says, Lamaisa, if the mikveh, that means if the hole, because we're talking about two holes in the ground, if the hole on the right has less than the hole on the left, and when you're going to pour hot water into the small hole, it's going to be more hot water than the water that's in there now, then you shouldn't be making lechatchila. But if there's going to be more original water than the hot water you're pouring in, ain't tzarich shum tikun kol. That is the end of Kuf Samachay. In the back of the Tzemach Tzedek, it's not, you don't see it in here, in the back of the book of the Tzemach Tzedek, there's ha'aras that were copied from Ksaviyah that Tzemach Tzedek wrote on the side of his chuvas. Sometimes he added a piece, sometimes he just made a comment. On this tshuva Kuf Samach Daled, not Kuf Samachay, he writes, Ayin mizeh b'ma shekosafti b'dinei mikveh madura kama. Look what I wrote in Dinei Mikveh Madura Kama. What is that? What is Dinei Mikveh Madura Kama? Yeah, we went a few times already in Shiurim. There is, the Tzemach Tzedek wrote a long beard on the Alter Rebbe's mikveh. He wrote a Madura Kama, which is in Siman Shin Lamed something in the end of Tzemach Tzedek. And he wrote a Madura Basra, which is in Siman Kuf Ayin Vav in the Tzemach Tzedek. We're going to look through Siman Kuf Ayin Vav. In short, we're going to put the points of what the Tzemach Tzedek brings over there. We know that the Tzemach Tzedek goes through, he splits up the takana of the Alter Rebbe about the box and how to make the box. And he explains each detail of the Alter Rebbe. It goes through 30 pages, every detail of the Alter Rebbe, every detail of the takana, why it was done. Right, so he explains it's three chalakim, chelik aleph, beis, and gimel in Siman Kuf Ayin Vav. So he explains why you need a tefach al tefach, kamatzirimin, and over here in chelik gimel of his biur, the Tzemach Tzedek explains why the Alter Rebbe wanted that when you fill up, you have to make sure that the hole on the bottom of the box should be closed well. It says yesasum samuch me'oid. The hole should be very close. There should be a piece of wood under the hole that's on the bottom of this box. So it should close very well when it's placed on top of it. So the Tzemach Tzedek in Chelik Gimel, and he says he starts from Ois Gimel. He explains what the tour that we brought, the tour that we brought, according to the tour. He says, according to the Tur says, the ones who are machmer in a case of a zchila, when you toivel in the mikveh, that's going to be zeichel. It's even if the simple understanding is it's possible even if you toivel in the memsa'ah that are going to remain in the mikveh, toivel below the crack. And when is it a problem? He says when there's a nekev, which is tefach al tefach. When there's such a big hole, which is tefach al tefach, and the zchila is considered zchila nikeres. But less than tefach al tefach, and especially if it only goes drip by drip, a very small amount of water going out, it's not considered zchila hanikeres. It's not considered zchila hanikeres. So therefore, when you have on the bottom of the mikveh a hole which is tefach al tefach, the whole mikveh is considered zoichel until the water evens out with the water next to it. Because right now, it's not like a crack on the side. Right now, every single drop of water in this box is going to come out of the hole because the hole's in the bottom, not on the side. Every single drop of water is going to come out of the hole. And the hole is big enough that it's zchila nikeres. Therefore, that's later. I'm saying, but if would be up, it would be a zchila nikeres. And even according to the Rosh, if this hole is in the bottom of the mikveh, so what's being zoichel? The top water is not moving out right now because the Rosh explains the water next to the hole is the one that's moving out. Which hole is that? The water on the bottom, right? Right, so the water on the bottom is the water that's moving out. That's the water which is being zoichel, not the water on top. The water on the bottom is being zoichel because that's right next to the crack. Until you don't see it even out with the water around it, it seems like the water is going out of the hole on the bottom. All the water is going to ultimately go out of it. And the Rosh is only makel when you have 40 sa'ah remaining below the crack, according to the Torah.
But in that situation, like all of the bottom, you could say that only the water next to the crack is going to go. Once it's in the bottom, everything is on top of it.
That's what he explains now, yeah. So the water that's under the crack, as it said, Rosh is only the Rosh be'etzem personally is makel even below the crack, less than 40 sa'ah remaining. But the way the Torah paskins according to the Rosh, if it's below the crack, you have to have 40 sa'ah. Over here, you have not 40 sa'ah below the crack. The crack is the bottom of the bird. So all the water is going to come out. All the water is on the way out of it. And then it's similar to a mayon. It's a zchila. If you would pick up the box, the water would come out in a flow like a mayon because it's a big hole. Therefore, it all becomes zoich. But over here, what's going to happen? The top water is not coming out of the mikveh, right? Because by the time the water is going to even out with the river next to it, the top water is going to remain in the mikveh. So you can make a cheshbon, but you're going to lose 4 inches, 5 inches. Only the bottom 5 inches are going to come out. The top water is going to be kosher. It's a reverse of what we learned before. Before we said the crack is on close to the bottom, you have to have 40 sa'ah below the crack because all the top water is going to go out. Over here, you're talking about the holes in the bottom, so only the bottom water is going to go out. Yeah, so therefore, it's going to stop leaking, so why do you have to wait till the water evens out? So he says, the reason why you have to wait till the water evens out, even though only a part of the water is going to go out, is why is the water not coming out of the box? Because of the river water outside. It hits the same level as the river water, stops leaking out. If there will be only a hole, there will be no water around it, it will all come out. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe said you should make a plank on the bottom to make sure it's closed well, so the water is not going to go out fast through this hole, just tefach al tefach. It's not going to be a zchila hanikeres. Right, that's how he begins. That's the Machzedek says. The zchila is not from mikveh to mikveh. The zchila is not going out. You have a river, the zchila is going from one mikveh to another mikveh. It's going within the same place. It's going from water to water. Really shouldn't be considered a zchila b'chlal. You have a tefach al tefach hole. It's more than shoferes hanoid. So that solves it. There shouldn't be. That only helps you because now you have an iruv mikvahs, a chibur. It all becomes one mikvah. It becomes ashboiren.
So
Elamai, because Elamai, no. When you have a chibur mikvos is when the water doesn't leave and new water comes instead of it. Yeah, because the water over here, the water that's coming out of the box, Lu Yitzur, the hole will be a little bit higher up. All the water would drain out. New water would come in from the river. That water that left the box is never coming back into your mikveh. And therefore, it's considered a zchilah. Yeah, according to Marik and the Shach, it's considered a zchilah even from mikveh to mikveh. And that's the Machzedek goes even further. It's Zayin, he says, no. Really, even this is not a zchilah. Even if it doesn't come back, it's also not considered a zchilah. I'm not going to get into it. He says, but the Marik says it is considered a zchilah. Yeah, the Marik and the Tashbetz, the Machzedek goes through the whole thing. So it's Vav, Zayin, Ches, Tes, Yud. And then he concludes in Ois Yud Aleph that if you want to go with the approach of Iruv Mikvos, that Tefach al Tefach is to solve, is to make the two Mikvos together, then what goes out from one mikveh to another mikveh is not considered a zchilah. It still becomes all ashbayrim. So when would the zchilah be considered a zchilah? If there would not be a mikveh right next to that mikveh. If there will be a mikveh here and there will not be a mikveh right next to that mikveh, then a tefach al tefach is considered a big enough zchilah and ikeres to make it possible. But less than that is not considered a zchilah and ikeres. Oh, one from 480? Why is it? No, over there he's using an example. He says 1 from 480 is for sure not a problem. If it goes out when you're toiveling. Over here he says if it's less than tefach al tefach, it's not a zchilah. Yeah, much more. Yeah, that's the share. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty much the way that Tzemach Tzedek understands the zchilah, and the way Tzemach Tzedek is poisek when it comes to zchilah, which is very mekel, very very mekel. What the definition of zchilah is? Obviously, when we make a mikveh, we're not going to deal with these kinds of questions, but it's important to understand the yesodus of what's really considered a zchilah when you have a shayla on water which is going out of the mikveh. And someone says it's a shayla of zchilah, you should measure and see if it's taka a shayla of zchilah, hanikeres, even according to Tzemach Tzedek, in the amount of time. You have to see how much the water drops and how long it takes for that to drop. Zchilah hanikeres, that person who's toiveling in the mikveh. Not that you leave a mikveh for 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours and you see it dropping a half an inch. That's not zchilah hanikeres. Hanikeres is you standing in the mikveh, you see it going down. It's a long tshuva. Yeah.
Exactly. When a person goes in, when a person